All right, welcome everybody. Thanks for listening to Hermit Radio. I'm your host, Cameron. Today I have an awesome guest, somebody I've been excited to talk to, Peter Bolland, and he is a professor of philosophy and humanities. Peter, thank you for being here.
Thank you so much, Cameron. Love this whole thing that you're doing, and I'm honored to be a part of it.
Yeah. So a little background for the listeners. I actually found Peter on YouTube and some of his videos that go very in depth into religious philosophies and kind of a little bit deeper than that, because to me, when I watch what you do, it's not just breaking it down like a professor, I feel like you take a risk by going deeper into the meanings of things. And I appreciate that because those are the same kind of questions and thoughts that I'm having. And there's not many people that are willing to talk about it on that level. So today I'm hoping we can do that.
Oh, absolutely. I'm glad you noticed that because for me, it's always personal. The purpose of philosophy is not just the amassing of information or knowledge. The purpose of philosophy is, in my view, is to heal and to be made whole. And those words kind of mean the same thing. And so that's what I'm always drawn to, whether it's Stoicism or the Tao Te Ching or Buddhism or Christian mysticism or the Sufis or whatever it is. I'm drawn to it because I hear voices there that I kind of recognize as my own best thoughts. Not,
Yeah.
You know what I mean? There's always a recognition there. And you can also feel in their longing, the same longing that all of us have to come out of confusion and into clarity. So it's deeply personal.
So to get us started, I want to actually, I have a theory about something and I want to propose it to you, and then it'll help get into the next conversations. But so I've studied in great detail the Dead Sea Scrolls and things like the Gospel of Thomas and these other things. In my opinion, and I think that you share this opinion, they resemble deeply the cultures and philosophies of the Far East, things like Zen and Buddhism and Hinduism. And then there's more, those are just the top three. But there was an idea that I had, and there was something interesting that I had read in the Bible that I felt like translated very well for this idea of Eastern philosophy. And here's the example. Jesus, when he gets his disciples, he changes their names. Now, to me, when I read this, what that meant to me was that he was changing their names because he said not only did he tell them to leave their physical belongings, but they're who they used to be. So he changed their names because their identities were made up anyways, their egos, to leave those behind too. You're now this person, which is a person that is following, the Christ, the anointed one. What do you think about that?
I think it's brilliant. It really is a universal dynamic. I know you're a veteran, and the first thing they do to you, like the first week, is shave your head, change your name. They start calling you by your last name, and it's an ancient ritual to die to self, and to be reborn into a new identity, into a whole new stance in the world. And so that is ubiquitous. It's common all over the world to be given a new name to signify, you've got some new priorities, some new tasks, some new things to do now. And I think that's a rich connection to notice in any spiritual or transformational experience. Especially in the Christian tradition, the Greek word that is translated in the Gospels as born again it's translated as other things, is metanoia. And metanoia just really means kind of a new way of thinking. Leaving behind, as you said, the old identity and being reborn. And we can see that is analogous across these traditions to come into enlightened consciousness. You still have to pay your bills and pick up after the dog, life goes on, but everything is seen through a new lens now. I think that's a nice connection.
Yeah. I'm glad you said that. I I actually had a person on my podcast some time ago, and I asked him that question, and I could see that it was frazzling some wires in his mind, and he didn't really want to get into it, and I don't think it was because he didn't understand. I think that was a big thing for me to say, and that is what we're talking about. I think when you dissect the Gospel of Thomas, I think we find that there's something there that people are afraid or maybe uncomfortable to see.
There is no doubt. And I'm a big fan of the Gospel of Thomas too. Maybe you ran across my video on YouTube
Yes,
about it.
yes, I have.
I just read a bunch of passages and comment on the Gospel of Thomas, and it's a challenging book, not for maybe folks like you and I, but for people who are more Orthodox Christian, who especially might come from an evangelical or fundamentalist perspective, where the teachings they come from say that the Bible is the inerrant word of God and these are the books, and the Gospel of Thomas is not in the Bible, so it's like it's got to be bad, right?
Right.
And I don't come into it from that perspective. I didn't grow up in a religious home. I found religion and philosophy when I was in college and have loved it ever since, and have been teaching it now for 30 years. But the Gospel of Thomas plays with that question specifically. I think it's chapter 13. It's the longest passage, where Jesus kind of has this exam day. He's the teacher and his disciples are the students, and he says, "Tell me what I am like," which he also does in the Gospel of Mark. There's so many parallels between Thomas and the other Gospels. And one by one, they offer these definitions, but only Thomas says, "Teacher, my mouth is utterly unable to say what you are like." So Thomas is affirming the ineffability of the spiritual essence of Jesus. He can't label him. And according to the passage, Jesus pulls Thomas aside and whispers 3 sayings in his ear that aren't in the text. And then Thomas comes back to Matthew and the other guys, and they're all, what did Jesus say to you? And he said, if I told you what Jesus told me, you would stone me, and fire would come from the stones and consume you. It's like this crazy scene where, talk about esoteric or hidden sayings. So apparently Thomas passed the test by affirming the ineffability of the teacher. And therefore he kind of went to a higher level, and he was whispered in his ear some even deeper teachings, which aren't even in the text. That's just a crazy story, but it's exciting because it captures, the difficulty of conveying wisdom, that it can't be spoken, that it can't be packaged, and that the receiver has to be ready. That Indian saying, when the student is ready, the teacher will appear. That, no matter how brilliant and enlightened the teacher is, it's just water off a duck, if the student isn't ready, isn't receptive. And I think that's across all the traditions.
100%. And in your particular video, the further part of this is you talked about, and you said it beautifully, because I had the same understanding, but you put it in a way that made it easier to understand, which is, back then, what would you be stoned for, right? 2 things pretty much, which is adultery and blasphemy.
Right.
And so, speculation is whatever was said, the 3 sayings are blasphemy, but only according to the faith of the people of this time. And I think that is the story of Jesus, is that, and I asked some people that I work with, we were having a conversation, and I can't help myself sometimes, but they, we're talking, and I said, do you think Jesus was a practicing Jew? And they said, well, yeah, clearly. I'm like, well, then why do we have a different religion named something else? Why aren't we
You're
all
a troublemaker, aren't you?
I am a troublemaker. And they looked at me, and I could just tell, I don't know. And then I was like, well, let me ask you this, could it be that he was telling them that this particular religion, that what's going on here maybe there's more to it, or it's not quite what you think it is? And I think that that's the truth of it, is that he wasn't there is a prophet for his own faith that he grew in. I think that he was coming with something different, something more.
It's, these are provocative possibilities. It's so difficult to look back at a figure who lived 2,000 years ago, and none of the texts are 100% reliable, and on and on and on. So we all get to sort of have our own Jesus, right. and that's great, but it's also deeply problematic when we start arguing about the right portrait of Jesus. Right. So luckily, I don't have a position to defend, really. I just love all the different scholarship around it. And I'm struck by the possibility that Jesus appears quite rebellious in his own time. He's certainly critical of the official religion that he belongs to and its current leadership, just like all spiritual teachers. They're critical of those in power. Let's just keep it simple. And it's not like he's trying to abandon his religion. He doesn't badmouth Judaism. He loves the temple. He quotes the Torah all the time. He's deeply Jewish. But on the other hand, he's not forming a new religion either. It's not like, hey, y'all come over here, let's start a new thing. And so what I'm struck by is that, again, a kind of almost a Zen portrait of Jesus as not that interested in religion. He's like, y'all just do your own, go ahead and do the old rituals, but I have a new way of thinking about what those old rituals mean. Like that great Zen saying, Matsuo Basho, that do not follow in the footsteps of the wise men of old. Instead, seek what they sought. So Jesus is about metanoia, I think. And this is my Jesus, right? This is my take. He's about awakening into a deeper consciousness where one feels more immediately the sacred, the holy. And I'll just kind of leave it there, because to me that's a Vedanta idea, it's a Buddhist idea, it's Taoist, it's awaken to the wonder of here and now, not some future where all the obedient ones get rewarded.
Right. And I think that your point there, right, that you said he is deeply Jewish and he quotes the Torah, and there are so many examples of that. And one of my favorite ones is when the people bring the woman, right? And they're like, what say you, Jesus? This woman is an adulterer. What does he do? They're talking to him and, trying to convince him. He gets down on her level and he starts writing into the ground with his finger. And for a lot of people, they might miss that. But what is that? That's a resemblance, because that is something that happened in their belief, which is that God wrote into the ground, into the stone with his finger for Moses. And what Jesus is doing is he's showing them, you don't need to tell me the law. I know the law. I know the law. And then, right, when he says, ye without sin cast the first stone, right? If you were paying attention, that means that if he was really truly without sin, he could have cast the stone, but he didn't, just like they couldn't. And I feel like there's like dual meanings, right? Kind of in the same aspect of these Eastern traditions, there's usually a parable, or there's like a dual meaning for something.
That's one of my favorite stories in the Gospels, the Gospel of John, chapter 8, the story of the adulterous woman, which, by the way, Bart Ehrman, in his incredible book, Misquoting Jesus, Bart Ehrman shows that story did not even exist in the earliest drafts of the Gospel of John. It showed up somewhere in the middle of the 2nd or 3rd century, which kind of blows my mind. Like, where did it come from? But I still think that is such a rich story, because you have the teacher Jesus here portrayed in a very Socratic philosophical dance. He's given this binary ultimatum. Either, these Pharisees and scribes show up and they say to Jesus, you either help us carry out capital punishment by community execution, namely stoning of this person we caught in the very act of adultery, or you don't. And the implication is, if you don't, you're no Jew and you're certainly not a Messiah. And so they were testing him, John tells us. And so, damned if you do, damned if you don't thing. And Jesus finds this third way out of the dilemma. It's a false dilemma. And he says, fine, as you said, whoever's without sin, throw the first stone. So Jesus puts it back on the individual level. Like, let's not go around executing each other for perceived transgressions. Instead, who are you? And the story ends with that line, basically, when he goes back down to the ground, he's drawing, and then he gets up and all the men are gone and it's just him and the woman, right? And she says, he says to her, where did everybody go? It's like he's tuning in and out. He's so spiritual in this story. And she said, everybody left. And then he said, well, you should go too and sin no more. So the message that Christian preachers have been preaching on for centuries now, 2,000 years, is I guess I'll sum it up this way. God doesn't care as much about what you did as about who you are right now. And what you do next is everything. What you did a moment ago is kind of nothing. And that's a really interesting spiritual message that comes out of that story. It's a fantastic story.
Yeah, it's definitely one of my favorites, and I think about it often, because, for me, what is interesting about all of this is that, at first it's hard to understand what all of this is about, especially not growing up religious or being in a church. Like, I'd say I'm more spiritual than religious. I don't cling to a particular religion. I like them all.
Yeah.
I think they all have beauty. And honestly, I think that they all have a meeting point where they came from at some point. But that doesn't mean that they need to go back to that. I think that all of them, the way that they have branched out is beautiful. And I think that there's so much to learn that way. How interesting would it be if it was all the same one thing? So I think it's beautiful. But for me, it's like I really truly see this person as an example to live by, right? Like, because that's all he's really asking people to do. Follow me, be like, do as I do, right? And you've said a couple of really good things in some of your videos talking about like where he says that specifically, right? Like if you speak the words out of my mouth or something to that effect, you mean being like me, right? Not being Jesus, but being kind, being a good person,
Yeah.
forgiving. And then that right there, that where I started getting into that is when I was learning about Buddhism.
Mm-hmm.
Buddhism was easier for me to understand because it wasn't so much about heaven and hell and going this, where, and doing this. It was what is going on with your mind.
Right.
Get your mind right. See the world differently, and it will be differently. And just those things, it was such an easy shift into Jesus because I felt like everything he was saying made more sense that way.
There's no doubt. I followed a similar trail that you did. I warmed up to Buddhism and Hinduism and Taoism long before I warmed up to Christianity. And it was for that reason, and staying with the Buddhist example, that the emphasis is not on some transcendent deities and our loyalty to them or whatever, or our obedience to this list that some church guys made up. Instead, it's notice that what you call the world is really just a portrait shaped by your own mind, shaped by your own consciousness, and that we are the authors of our own experience largely. And I think that's just a fascinating contribution to the world philosophical project to remind us that, as Buddha said in the Dhammapada, our life is a product of our thoughts. Our thoughts of yesterday built our life of today. Our thoughts of today build our life of tomorrow. Our life is a product of our thoughts. And so that isn't a unique idea to Buddhism, but it's emphasized there, I think, more than in other traditions. And so that was compelling to me, and especially the Four Noble Truths that there is suffering, but suffering has a cause, and it's generally my egoic attachment to things, and when I don't get what I want, that's what generates the suffering. And so to let go of craving would mean to reduce my suffering. And that's what the Stoics are teaching in ancient Rome and philosophy as well. And that's a powerful stance in the world, and not one mention of God or anything in all of that, right? So it was really, and you're right, that did open the door. Then I could go back to the Gospels and go, okay, here's a teacher who's telling his students, he doesn't really talk about being born again or heaven and hell. I mean, all that damnation and salvation and all that stuff isn't really big on Jesus's list. He's talking basically about feed starving people, heal people, offer comfort, and love one another. And again, that last week of his life, and when he says to his disciples that in the future, when I'm gone, people will know who my followers are by how well they love one another. And so that's the transformation. That's the metanoia. That's the enlightenment, is to stop being here just for me, but to start being here for everyone else. And that's a connection between Buddhism and the teachings of Jesus that is just unmistakable.
Yeah, I agree. I think that there are parallels there. So shifting gears now. Well, I guess I got one more question that I want to touch based on Christianity, and then we'll move into Buddhism and Zen. And this is a question that I have hard time finding the answer to. So I'm hoping that with your 30 years of experience, you'll be able to help me solve this one. So, okay, so we talked about, so Jesus dies and then his disciples live on, right? And then somewhere between,
not for very long, most of them get killed, but yeah.
Exactly, right. But somewhere between when Jesus dies and the disciples die, Christianity is formed, and then the Roman government accepts it and gets rid of paganism in favor of Christianity. Do you have a good basis of understanding of how that happened? What was the parameters? Like, why did the Roman government, after persecuting Jesus, then later adopt his religion in favor of paganism?
Yeah, well, I could say a couple things about that, of course, and I know you're a student of history as well. And, we're talking about compressing a 300-year period into a few minutes of conversation. Think about 300 years of American history and how damn long that is, and how, and how, we're not even there yet. We're not even up to 300 yet in terms of the revolution anyway. So that's a lot of changing hats of who's in charge. And that's a lot of new zeitgeists or, ways of being and seeing and doing things. So I think what generally happens is Christianity enters into the consciousness of the wider Roman Empire through a lot of different means. And the Roman Empire was eclectic, right? One of the things that they were pretty good at is, besides the invention of concrete and arches and harbors and aqueducts and the bureaucracy of empire and how to run, thousands and thousands of soldiers across, vast swaths of terrain. One of the things they were pretty good at is leaving local culture alone, largely. And as long as you paid fealty to Rome, they kind of let you keep your deal going, your own religion, whether it's Isis, the cult of Isis, or whatever the hell the Celts were doing. And, so they were they turned a blind eye toward multiculturalism. So Christianity just set up shop alongside all of these other traditions. And sure, some emperors went out of their way, Nero and Caligula and others, to persecute and slaughter as many Christians as possible because they saw them as threats. But others did not. Other Roman Empire emperors just ignored it. So when the Roman Empire itself began to collapse, and Augustine's a good source on this, right, in the 3rd century, when the Roman Empire began to collapse, it kind of leaves a power vacuum, and Christianity sort of fills in. And so Augustine, looking back, says that it is, in his Christian perspective, it is the providence of God that allowed the Romans to be so powerful and widespread as a way of transmitting Christianity all over the world, from Ireland to Egypt or whatever. So that is a long process. What the other piece I'll say is this, that there's something about the theology of early Christianity that was appealing to a wide range of people, educated and uneducated, wealthy city people and impoverished agrarian rural people. It kind of cut across a lot of socioeconomic barriers. Maybe by the 2nd and 3rd century, it kind of marries together with Stoicism, with that idea that, suffering is just a part of life and you have to accept it. But there is this order, as the Stoics called it, nature or logos, and the Christians are just going to call it God, that everything's going to be okay in the end. And if it's not okay, then it is not the end yet. And so that ends up being, I think, a worldview that for some reason or another, a lot of people gravitate toward. And then the last piece is Constantine in 313 and the Nicene Creed and marrying the Roman Empire together with the Christian church. And then you get and then 80 years later under Theodosius, Christianity becomes the official religion of the Roman Empire. And then you have it. the marriage of state and religion. And, pretty soon Christianity becomes somewhat unrecognizable from the teachings of Jesus.
Yes. Yeah, that's exactly, and that's kind of where I was going with that question, because I think that that's part of the problem. I mean, problem and beauty,
Opportunity. Yeah.
opportunity. Yes, exactly. Um, because for me, if you want to know if you want to know true Christianity, you just have to look at Jesus and what he says and what he did. And if it's not like that, then there may be some fields where it's gone astray and just need to get brought back to the center of gravity.
Mm-hmm.
But for people that are interested in that, I think that it's easier to get behind Jesus, the man, and who he was like bringing himself to the world as, than to adopt a religion. I think that's what turned me off as a kid. It was too big for me to grasp and understand and to fall into place. But just learning about the one person did make it easier. And that's why my life has turned into learning about people like this, like because it's not just Jesus, right? Like there's Buddha and all the gurus and yogis and saints that came in between, before and after. And I
Right.
think that there's a special connection that they all have. And then going into Buddhism, talking about the Buddha, right? His story is pretty similar to Jesus.
It is. And this is the archetype, right? To use Jung's and Joseph Campbell's terms, is the archetypal seeker, the hero's journey of the person who sort of comes out of obscurity, has this sort of breakthrough realization in his early 30s, and then ends up becoming a teacher of great impact. You could sort of create a side-by-side list. There's a lot of things that are different between Buddha and Jesus. Buddha comes from the top of the socioeconomic ladder, wealthy, protected, privileged life. Jesus comes from nothing, his father is proper. Well, his father's God, I guess, if you're a Christian, but his father, Joseph, is like a propertyless carpenter, doesn't own a cow, in a town called, born in Nazareth, which is like just a crossroads with like 6 houses. I mean, this is a kid up from the bottom. And so that is maybe not important, but they have very different kind of origins. But they get to this place where they have these burning kind of questions and crises, and they both learn quite a bit about their local philosophical and religious traditions, and then they become reformers of those traditions. So there's a lot of parallels.
The one thing that the one connection I made early on was the fasting, right? The fasting, meditating for 40 days. And I've been trying to wonder, obviously it doesn't matter truly, it's part of a story. But I do often wonder about that. I am a student of meditation myself. I do enjoy fasting. What do you think about that? Do you think that there's something there, or do you think that's just part of the story?
No, I think it's common around the world. These are ascetic practices, and my deep dive this last year and a half or two has been, I've been reading a lot of Thomas Merton, and that's been leading me back into the Christian mystics. And I'm finally actually reading Julian of Norwich and St. John of the Cross and so many of the other tremendous voices from the Middle Ages, from the Roman Catholic tradition, the dominant Christian tradition, which is a tradition deeply committed to the idea of asceticism, of playing with, disengaging from the material world of comfort, as a way of kind of focusing several things, focusing on the interior life, breaking the habit of just satiating every craving as soon as it comes along. And so I think all around the world, and certainly true in India, and it's not as true in the Jewish tradition, which is kind of interesting, although, there is the abstention from certain kinds of food and so on. But particularly in that story of Jesus and the story of Buddha in their fasting, that is a parallel to pull away from the world. But as we know from the story of the Buddha, it ends up not doing anything. It's useless. And the first thing he teaches when he starts eating again. And after his enlightenment, the first sermon he gives is on two subjects: the Four Noble Truths and the middle path. And the middle path is asceticism doesn't work, nor does its opposite, sensual indulgence and excess and addiction. So find that middle path. We have to be in the world, but be moderate about your consumption of it. And that's the path that leads to enlightenment, according to Buddha.
And then the parallel to that in the Gospel of Thomas is Jesus says, right, he does talk about fasting, but he talks about fasting in regards to the world. And he says, do not do what you hate, because that was another question that he was asked. And there again, I just feel like those are similar things. Like they're alluding, coming from different places, but alluding to kind of the same thing, which is this idea of death to self, death to our selfish needs and wants of materialism. And it's ironic enough that you bring up studying Christian mystics and medieval. I've been doing the exact same thing, starting with St. Francis of Assisi. And that is just something about that story just absolutely captures me, because it's so beautiful. I mean, it would be very difficult to try to do that in today. I mean, it was hard to do it back then too, but still, think about, today, it's not just about giving up your money, it's about giving up your iPhone and your laptop and your Starbucks, to do that.
Yeah.
It's such a beautiful story.
It's funny. I just turned off my Facebook page. I deactivated all my Facebook pages a week ago. And I do that from time to time. This is going to be a long break. I'm going to stay off until November 1st. And that's my asceticism, right? It's just a way of kind of simplifying my mind and like taking one of the things off of my to-do list. And there's a certain lightness that comes into your life when you start letting go of certain things. And I like to practice that once in a while. Like the first time I did it was over the last winter holidays, last Christmas. And then I did it again for Lent. I'd never done Lent before, but I thought, what the heck, I'm gonna do this. Our Muslim friends do this fasting for Ramadan, right? It's so amazing. So for the whole month of Ramadan, they don't drink water or eat any food from sunrise to sunset for a month. And they get up early and have some food and water in the morning, of course, and then again a light meal at night. But the purpose of that practice is what we were talking about before. It's metanoia. It's breaking the slavish habit of just like, shoveling food into this hole in front of my face. It's about unconsciousness versus consciousness, living in what Eckhart Tolle calls the thought stream or the now. And sometimes you just need to change up the steps of your dance to kind of awaken you to who you really are and what you really need. And that's what these practices are about. They're not to be, you're not to browbeat others into following them or to preach about your holiness because you do this XYZ thing. It's about breaking out of unconsciousness.
Yeah, absolutely. And even in St. Francis's prayer, at the end of it, I've got it right here. He even says, it is in dying to self that we are born to eternal life.
Right.
And I don't know why it's so much easier to see it that way. And for me, and like my spiritual beliefs or whatever, it's like all of these things are so beautiful to me, but it's like I can't sit in one. I have to, I'm looking beyond all of them, right? Like in prayer, seeing people pray, like you were talking about Ramadan, like that's so beautiful the way that they do that. And sometimes I just want to do it just because I think it's so beautiful. And it's not about like thinking I'm going to get punished if I don't, or same thing with like going to church or whatever, right? It's like even meditation, right? Not punishing yourself because you didn't meditate today. Simple things, right? Be happy, be relaxed, be the witness to this life. Don't be the slave to it, be the witness to it. And I think that when we're going from Buddhism into Zen, that's where it takes it even farther, right? Because Buddhism, in my opinion, is very free flowing. It's very easy, I feel like, in my opinion, to navigate. But then when you start getting into Zen, it's a little bit more challenging, only because if you were to ask a Zen master, it's so obvious that it escapes people's minds, right? When we're talking about when the idea is like, stop thinking or stop thinking about that, right? But
Yeah.
there's, when you're giving it to somebody in a parable, it makes them work harder to get to the answer, but the answer is usually something very in front of your face.
No, exactly. And to connect that with the St. Francis prayer line that you cited, that when we die to self, we awaken to eternal life. And the old me would have been put off by that because there's that Christian promise of heaven with harps. And, it's like, that's not real. There's no afterlife or whatever, as a skeptical guy. And now I understand the Christian concept of eternal life differently, not as a literal afterlife, but as the best we can do to talk about the eternal present moment. That, the kingdom of heaven, that's what I love about the Gospel of Thomas. When Jesus says, don't look over here, don't look over there. The kingdom of heaven is within you and it is without you. It is lying, the Father's kingdom is lying all over the earth, only you do not see it. So that's a very Buddhist thing to say, that we're in nirvana already. There isn't samsara and nirvana, and you've got to get from samsara through your arduous meditation efforts to nirvana. The whole construct of spiritual seeking is bankrupt because the deeper insight is we already are that which we seek. The Christian mystics talk that way. They say that longing you have for God, that is God within you longing for itself. And there's no me in that. There's no I. So that's the sense of forgetting. But I love what you said about Zen Buddhism too. When you read about literal Zen practice, like what the monks do, you're like, oh my God, this is like the spiritual Olympics. I can't do that high level stuff. And so there's that tension again in any religious tradition. There's the insiders who throw it all off, who go live in the monastery, who are doing the Olympic level athletic achievement. And for folks like me who are lay people out in the world, I'm married, I got a mortgage, I got a job, and I got a dog and just normal stuff. And that it has to be recalibrated, how to be what in the Indian tradition we call the householder. I'm not a sannyasin who lives in the woods and threw it all off and changed my name, to go back to our first point. I'm Peter Bolland. I just, making the work that I do work out. And so what does Zen offer someone like me? What does any religious tradition offer something like me? Again, it's a way of jarring me out of my complacency and showing me other ways of awakening. And I just love the Zen tradition for its simplicity, its bare bones kind of clarity, and almost its kind of rudeness. It doesn't have a lot of patience for ornate speechifying or ornate temples. I love that.
Yeah, it reminds me, it gets like, if again, when we're doing comparison, when I think about what you just said about Zen, it makes me think about like what Jesus says, right? Like, don't be like the hypocrites. Don't pray in the streets and the synagogues for people to see, right? Or, like when you're fasting, don't make your face frail. Like, they have their reward, right? Like, don't
Yes.
be like the hypocrites. Like, they have their reward. Zen is the same way, right? Zen, if you want to go do all that, if you want to go pray and be like the Buddha, go ahead. That's not what we're here to do. What we're here to do is really make you human. Stop being more. Be what you
Yeah.
are. Be the presence. Be the witness. Be here now. Stop worrying about everything else. Stop trying to attain everything else. You already have it. You're happy. You just
Yeah.
need to realize it. And
Yeah. And to laugh along the way, have some fun. Because once you start taking yourself too seriously, it's all
absolutely.
about yourself then again.
And what you talked about being like in a monastery versus like, Western living, how you and I are doing it.
Yeah.
Pararahansa Yogananda talks about it in his book. Well, one of them, Diary of a Yogi, he
Yeah.
talks about how he wishes he could go and just be in the Himalayas and
Mm.
just meditate and sleep and eat and just not be in the world. But he says he has this deep inner feeling that he knows that that is not his life path. If it was, he would already be doing it. That's what it would be.
Mm.
But and I take that so much for my own life and for everyone else in this way, because yeah, like there is this way of living. And I'm not going to say it's easier, but you are running away a little bit. You are choosing to not participate in society, which means that like you have to go be in this condition right? Which is just another form of limiting the brain, which is conditions. Instead of being where you are, being in society, and still choosing to live consciously, to live as a self-realized human being. And I think that's what society is missing, and we need more of it. And so that is what I think the key for all of these spiritual teachings and things is we need to learn to be more conscious, and that is going to fix the problem of selfishness and greed and all of these things, right? Like those are the inherently the things that are ruining our society. And it's not impossible. We think it's impossible because it's not done all the time, and it's
This is
easier to be
rare.
greedy.
Yeah.
It's rare. But when we look at these teachers, these masters, they are the example. It's not
Yeah.
perfect, but that's a thing in the mind, is perfection.
And to do it where you are, if you're a mail carrier delivering junk mail up and down the street all day, um, you can be a Buddha doing that. You can be a Buddha teaching high school history. You can be a Buddha being a landscaper, or a doctor or a soldier. There's a lot of ways to serve, and I love that Hindu idea of dharma of of that the cosmos is an organized system called dharma that's supportive. The word comes from dri in Sanskrit, meaning to support, the way a hammock holds you up between two trees. So the whole cosmos is self-supporting. And the second meaning of dharma is what's my dharma? What's my duty? Where do I fit? I'm not a warrior. I'm not a doctor. I have my jobs, and the jobs that I have were revealed to me through what I was excited about. And I try to help my students see that too. That tired Joseph Campbell cliche: follow your bliss. And he did not mean just go do stuff that feels good. He meant figure out what the Sanskrit word is ananda. Figure out what makes you burn with enthusiasm, what you would do for free, like you making all the great podcasts that you do. And that's your dharma. That's your purpose. And so every one of us, by following our own bliss, in the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna says, whatever you love in the world, that's how you meet me. So there's God telling you, just do what you love, do it well, do it like it matters, because it does. Serve people, work without attachment to outcomes, and you've got it. Then your own bliss will just backfill. You don't search for happiness. You don't hunt it down. It never works. You can't find happiness by searching for it. Happiness is a byproduct of a purposeful, well-lived life. And there's always going to be tears, and there's going to be stuff that falls apart, and you're going to fail, and you're going to go down some wrong trails and have to backtrack. But in totality, I think one's life becomes more blissful when one is authentically following what you were born here to do. And that doesn't mean you don't have crappy jobs along the way. You have to be a barista for 8 years while you're, or whatever. So what? You get to serve people. You get to make awesome coffee for them. That's another way of being a bodhisattva. I worked in the service for years. I worked in retail all through college. I worked in a grocery store, customer service, and those were powerful experiences that I'm glad I got to have.
And I think taking that idea, it's something that Ram Dass said, which is when he was with his guru, and his guru, he asked his guru, he said, Maharaji, and he says, how do I become enlightened? And he says, serve people. And he goes, well, okay, well, how do I become like you or like the Buddha? And he says, feed people, right? And so what is he saying? He's saying, as we've been talking about, you already are. Do these things. You want to be where I am, do these things. And that concept is hard for people who are not religious or spiritual. Why do that for anyone? Why serve people? Why feed people? Why do that? Because what would you want, right? This is a very down-to-earth human way of looking at it. How would you want somebody to treat you on your worst day?
Yeah.
How would you want to be treated if you were homeless or if you were in pain, right? And then that same concept, again, we can bring that all the way back to Jesus and his stories, right? When the story of the man who's like dead on the road and the people who are walking past him, right?
Yeah.
And it's just a good Samaritan, right? There are priests and all these people that walk by, but it's just the good Samaritan that does the good, that does something about it.
That's another great parable, right? Because in Jesus' time, his audiences would have understood exactly what a Samaritan was. And for them, it was basically like us saying an Al Qaeda terrorist. You know, it was like the total outsider enemy of the Hebrew people were the Samaritans. They were at war with each other, like the Hatfields and McCoys. It's a bunch of Samaritans that just burned down a Jewish temple. And so Jesus pointedly tells a bunch of Hebrews a story in which the Hebrew authorities failed, the priest failed. And who's the good guy of the story? A terrorist, quote unquote, who is the only one who had a shred of humanity in him. And it's a powerful story, the story of the Good Samaritan. It goes far beyond like we should just be nice to each other. It pointedly reveals the absolute universality of our humanity, that even in our enemies, there is saintliness. And that's a pretty elevated level of spirituality. And I'm thinking of Dogen, the great Zen master, who, like what you were saying a moment ago about meditation, said, don't seek enlightenment. The work itself is liberation. So that is another way, again, of metanoia, kind of like giving us a new way of thinking. We don't sit and meditate because I'm going to get away from here and I'm going to go over there. I'm going to get out of suffering and get into nirvana. That kind of outcome oriented thinking, that's what the teachers are always trying to break us. So like, if you don't get it here, you're not going to get it anywhere. Let the work itself be liberating.
One of my favorite spiritual teachers that I feel like encapsulates all of these things is Osho. I don't know if you're familiar with Osho. Like he
A
has
little
some
bit.
controversy, obviously,
Yeah.
but I think if we take away the controversy and you really just go to his lectures and his books, there is really something there. Honestly, of all of the teachers, the Alan Wattses, the Eckhart Tolles, the Ram Dasses, the Yoganandas, Osho has taught and said things that I've listened to that really go beyond some of the superficial like barriers of like Buddhism and I love that he talks about all of them the way that you and I are talking about all of them, and he's not afraid to say that the things that he says. And I think that what we are talking about in totality, right, like it goes back to the question, why be good, why forgive others when they punch you in the face or whatever. I think it goes back to what Jesus said to Thomas, or to Peter, with the three sayings. I think it goes back to whatever those three things were, whatever he whispered to him. I think that has something to do with it. And that's something deeper that everyone has to get on their own. They have to find that for themselves. But on the superficial level, that's not, really out there and could, get me chastised. I think what it comes down to is that we're all the same based on who we are as the presence, as the here and now, not as the fleshy exterior, right? Whether you call it a soul or a spirit or a presence, whatever you want to call, or a consciousness itself, that's the same. Those things, that is the same. It comes from the same place and it has the same goodness in it. And that's what you respect in everybody else. It's not the outside, not the ego, not because, the Bible told me so or my pastor said so. No, you respect the other person because you see the good in them just as they see the good in you. That's why, like when we bow, right, you're showing your crown to the other person. I think we need to get back to that.
Well, that's the perennial philosophy, as Aldous Huxley called it, that all is one. It's in the Upanishads, it's in all the great teachings that all of this is Brahman, and Brahman is formless. Brahman is not a deity. Brahman is the sacred ground of being beyond all categories of being and non-being even. And it's the most ultimate thing in the Sanskrit and in the Hindu tradition. And the teaching is that Brahman comes forth and takes form as all of this, as all energy, all matter, and all consciousness. So that's the recognition you just described, that when we show up and what Jesus calls the Father in me, and when Jesus says, so the Gospel of John is the most mystical of the Gospels. That's where he talks about his identity with the Father. And then he says, I am the vine, you are the branches. So I guess we're all branches of the Father, or of this holiness that is the central insight of these traditions. And speaking of controversial teachers, Osho, you could look up all kinds of stuff online about some pretty crazy stuff that went on in his huge and long career and big community. So I think there's a line to be walked there. We have to hold powerful people accountable for harm they've caused. But what I also take away from that is every teacher is just a guy like you and me, a woman like, anybody else, full of their humanness, and a little power and a little money, sends most of us into a tailspin. And I'm not forgiving anybody for things they have not yet atoned for. It's not my job, but I do want to step out of the game of finding flaw with everybody about everything. I'm a big fan of Joseph Campbell, right? I teach him all the time, Here with a Thousand Faces. But he is just a creature of his time. He's born in 1903, 1908, something like that. He grew up in the early 20th century. And when you look through his work, he's kind of sexist. He skirts around the edge of anti-Semitism in some of his published articles, a little dismissive of Judaism. But that's what Catholicism was in the mid 20th century, So again, I'm not excusing it. I want to acknowledge it. I want to see it. But I'm not going to throw the entire body of work of what Joseph Campbell has shown out, because he was, he didn't say everything perfectly according to my current value system. Hell, my own dad, who's now gone, he said some crazy stuff in his life. I was like, you just said what? But I love the guy, so it's like it's like back to that Gospel of John story, just go and sin no more.
I think that's a great way to end things here. I'm so grateful that I could get you to do this with me. There's so much good in what we talked about, and
Awesome.
as long as you're open to it, I'd love to have you back, because I think that you and I could have some really great discussions as far as all of this is concerned.
Cameron, I'm available anytime. This is so easy to do. It's a pleasure to join you. You're in Tennessee, I'm in California. And through the miracle of these machines, we get to have this chat, and then folks can enjoy it on their own time. It's great. Why wouldn't I want to come back? So yes.
Okay, cool. Well, we're going to stop recording here. Thanks everybody for listening to Hermit Radio. We'll catch you next week.